spending years behind cold metal bars, watching as every other dog finds a home, except you. That was Hunter's life, but just when he had given up hope, something incredible happened. Watch till the end to see how one moment changed everything for him. Hunter had been in the shelter for what felt like forever. Every morning, the same routine played out before him. The shelter doors would open, and visitors would walk in, their eyes scanning the rows of kennels filled with dogs desperate for attention. Puppies would jump and wag their tails, yipping excitedly as hands reached through the bars to pet them. Some dogs barked loudly, trying to catch the visitors' interest. Others whimpered softly, pressing their faces against the metal, hoping to be chosen. Hunter used to do the same. In his early days at the shelter, he had barked eagerly, his tail wagging in hopeful anticipation. He had watched as people cooed over the younger, smaller dogs, signing papers, giving hugs and walking out the door with their new companions. One by one, the dogs around him left, while he remained. At first, he didn't understand why. He was friendly. He was gentle. He wasn't aggressive or sick. Yet time and time again, people walked past his kennel without a second glance. As the months stretched into years, something inside Hunter changed. His excitement faded, replaced by quiet resignation. He no longer rushed to the bars when visitors arrived. He no longer wagged his tail in hopeful anticipation. Instead, he curled up in the corner of his kennel, watching silently as others were chosen. The shelter was a noisy place filled with constant barking and the clanging of metal bowls against concrete floors. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the scent of fur and damp straw. The days blended together, each one the same as the last. Feedings happened at the same time every day. Volunteers came and went, some staying long enough to scratch his ears before moving on to the next dog. The nights were quieter, but loneliness settled in like a heavy blanket. Hunter remembered what it was like to have a home. It was a distant memory now, faded around the edges, but still there. He had once had a warm bed, a backyard to run in, a person who loved him. But something had gone wrong. He wasn't sure what had happened. Maybe his owner had moved, or maybe they had decided he was too much trouble. All he knew was that one day he was left at the shelter, and they never came back. At first he had waited, convinced they would return for him. Every time someone walked past his kennel, his ears perked up, his heart racing with hope. But as the days passed and no familiar face appeared, that hope slowly dimmed. Time moved differently in the shelter. Days felt like weeks. Weeks felt like months. Hunter had seen dogs come and go, some finding homes within days, others spending months before they too were chosen. But he remained. A few times someone had stopped and looked at him. Once a family had even taken him outside to the play area. His heart had pounded with excitement as he wagged his tail and nuzzled their hands. But in the end, they had chosen another dog, one younger and more playful. He had learned not to get his hopes up. It was easier that way. Hope hurt. Hope meant disappointment. So he waited day after day, watching as the world moved on without him. The morning started like any other. The shelter staff arrived, turning on the lights and beginning their daily routine. Dogs barked excitedly, tails thumping against kennel walls as the scent of breakfast filled the air. Hunter barely lifted his head. He had long since stopped getting excited over meals. It was just another part of the endless cycle of shelter life. As he lay in his corner, listening to the sounds of the shelter waking up, he heard footsteps approaching. He didn't bother looking up. People came and went all the time. pausing in front of kennels, murmuring to the younger dogs, offering treats and soft words before moving on. He had no reason to believe today would be any different. Then a voice reached his ears, gentle, curious. "This one," the voice said. Hunter slowly lifted his head. A woman stood outside his kennel, crouching down to meet his gaze. She wasn't gushing like most visitors did when they saw a puppy. She wasn't looking past him at the next kennel. She was looking at him. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, reaching out carefully. Her fingers brushed the bars of the kennel, an invitation rather than a demand. Hunter hesitated before standing up, stretching out his stiff legs. He took a cautious step forward, sniffing the air. She smelled different, like fresh air and something comforting, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. A shelter worker approached. "That's Hunter," she said. "He's been here a long time." The woman nodded. "Can I take him out to the yard?" The worker smiled, grabbing a leash. "Of course." A few moments later, the kennel door opened, and Hunter felt the leash clip onto his collar. He followed the woman outside, blinking as the morning sun hit his face. It had been a while since he had been in the play yard. He padded over to the grass, feeling the cool earth beneath his paws. The woman followed, giving him space but watching him closely. She knelt down and held out her hand. "Come here, boy." Hunter hesitated. He had been in this situation before. People had taken him outside, petted him, played with him for a few minutes, and then walked away. But there was something different about her. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't distracted. She was just there, waiting. Slowly he stepped forward, pressing his nose against her palm. She smiled, rubbing his head gently. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" Hunter closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. He had almost forgotten what this felt like. The warmth of a human hand, the softness of a voice that wasn't just passing by. The woman turned to the shelter worker. "What's his story?" The worker sighed. "He came in a few years ago. No one ever claimed him. He's great with people, but most adopters want younger dogs." The woman nodded thoughtfully. She looked back at Hunter, her eyes soft. "I'll take him." Hunter's ears twitched. Had he heard that right? The shelter worker seemed surprised. "Are you sure?" "He's older. It might take some time for him to adjust." "I'm sure," the woman said without hesitation. She turned back to Hunter. "You've waited long enough, haven't you?" For the first time in a long time, something flickered in Hunter's chest. Hope. A few hours later, he walked out of the shelter, leash in hand, next to the woman who had chosen him. As they stepped into the world beyond the shelter gates, Hunter felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt home. The car ride home was quiet. Hunter sat in the back seat, his body tense, unsure of what to expect. The shelter had been his world for so long that stepping outside of it felt overwhelming. He watched through the window as buildings passed by, the motion lulling him into a strange state between anxiety and curiosity. The woman, his new owner, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You okay back there, buddy?" Her voice was warm, soothing. Hunter didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he was okay. The last time he had ridden in a car, it had been the day he was taken to the shelter. Back then, he had been confused, scared. Now, years later, he was feeling those same emotions, but something was different. There was no sense of abandonment in this ride. This time, he was going somewhere. The car slowed and turned onto a quiet street lined with trees. A small house came into view, the front yard neat and inviting. The car stopped, and the woman got out, opening the back door for Hunter. "Come on, let's go home." Home. He hesitated at the word. Could this place really be his home? Slowly he stepped out, his paws touching the pavement. He sniffed the air, catching scents of grass, flowers, and something cooking nearby. Everything was unfamiliar, yet there was no feeling of danger. He followed the woman to the front door, his steps cautious but willing. Inside, the house was warm and cozy. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft light on wooden floors. A dog bed sat in the corner of the living room, next to a basket filled with toys. Bowls of food and water were set neatly in the kitchen. "This is your space now," the woman said, kneeling beside him. She let him take in his surroundings at his own pace, not rushing him. Hunter sniffed the couch, the rug, the walls. The scents were new, but there was something comforting about them. They smelled lived in. They smelled like her. She walked to the kitchen and grabbed a treat from a container. "Here you go, buddy." He took it gently from her hand, chewing slowly. It tasted better than the dry kibble from the shelter. Everything here was different. It felt softer, kinder. That first night, Hunter lay in his new bed, curled up tightly. He was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was too busy processing everything: the house, the woman, the fact that he was no longer behind bars. He listened to the quiet sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards as the woman moved around. Then soft footsteps approached. "You okay, Hunter?" she whispered. His tail thumped once against the bed. He didn't know how to show her that he appreciated everything. He didn't know how to tell her that he was scared but also grateful. She knelt beside him, stroking his head gently. "You're safe now." Safe. It had been so long since he had felt that way. Over the next few days, Hunter adjusted to his new life. Mornings were different now. Instead of the shelter's metal gates opening to the sound of barking dogs, he woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of birds outside the window. The woman, his person, took him on walks through the neighborhood, letting him sniff at every tree, every mailbox. She was patient with him, never pulling him away too soon. They settled into a routine. He ate his meals in the kitchen while she cooked hers. He napped by her feet as she worked at her desk. In the evenings, they sat on the couch together, her hand resting on his back as she watched TV. Little by little, the fear he had carried for so long began to fade. One afternoon, she brought out a tennis ball. "Want to play?" she asked, tossing it gently. Hunter watched the ball roll across the floor. He had never really played before. At the shelter, toys had been scarce, and he had never seen a reason to chase after something that wasn't food. But when he looked up at her, he saw excitement in her eyes. She wanted him to play. Cautiously, he walked over to the ball and nudged it with his nose. She laughed, clapping her hands. "That's it, good boy." Something in his chest warmed at her praise. Encouraged, he picked up the ball and brought it back to her. For the first time in years, he felt like a dog again. Days turned into weeks, and each day Hunter grew more comfortable. He no longer hesitated before stepping into the house after a walk. He no longer flinched at unexpected noises. He wagged his tail more freely, leaned into her touch without fear. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, she whispered, "I'm so glad I found you." Hunter rested his head on her lap, sighing deeply. For the first time in a long time, he truly believed he belonged. The days turned into weeks, and Hunter's new life slowly became familiar. The once hesitant steps he took into the house became confident strides. The cautious glances he gave his new owner turned into trusting looks. The fear that had clung to him like a shadow began to lift. replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: security. Mornings were no longer spent waiting behind cold metal bars for breakfast. Now he woke up to the soft sound of his owner moving around the house, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. He stretched on his dog bed before padding over to the kitchen, where she greeted him with a warm smile and a gentle scratch behind his ears. "Morning, buddy," she'd say as she poured his food into the bowl. Hunter wagged his tail, a habit that had once felt foreign to him. He ate his breakfast peacefully, no longer feeling the need to rush or guard his food. No one would take it from him here. After breakfast, they went on their daily walk. The first time she had clipped the leash onto his collar, he had stiffened, memories of being led through shelter corridors flashing through his mind. But her voice had been gentle, reassuring. Now the leash was no longer something to fear. It meant adventure. They walked through the neighborhood, past houses with well-kept gardens, where other dogs barked from behind fences. Hunter no longer shrank back at the sound. He had learned that not every bark was a threat. He had learned that this world was bigger than the shelter's concrete walls. One day they ventured beyond the neighborhood to a park. Hunter had never seen so much open space before. His nose twitched at the scents: grass, damp earth, other animals that had passed through. She unhooked his leash. "Go on, Hunter. You're free to run." At first he hesitated. The idea of running without barriers, without limits, was foreign to him. He had spent so much time in confined spaces that he wasn't sure what to do with freedom. Then instinct took over. He bolted forward, his paws sinking into the soft earth, his ears flopping in the wind. The sensation was exhilarating. He ran in circles, darting back toward his owner, and then sprinting off again, feeling the strength in his legs, the power in his body. She laughed. "That's it. Run, buddy." He felt something in his chest swell. Joy. The days continued like this, each one a little better than the last. The fear that had once ruled his life became a distant memory. He no longer slept curled up in a tight ball, bracing himself for the unknown. Instead, he sprawled out on his bed, belly exposed, fully at ease. Evenings were his favorite. After dinner, they settled onto the couch. His owner would wrap herself in a blanket, and he would curl up beside her, his head resting on her lap. She would stroke his fur absent-mindedly as she watched television, and Hunter would sigh contentedly. "You're such a good boy," she often whispered. He didn't need to understand the words to feel their meaning. One night, as they sat together in the quiet of the house, a storm rolled in. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and soon after, thunder rumbled in the distance. Hunter's body tensed. Storms had always meant uncertainty, chaos. He had spent too many nights alone, listening to rain pound against the shelter's roof, feeling exposed and powerless. His owner must have noticed his unease. "Hey, it's okay," she murmured, wrapping her arms around him. "You're safe." She didn't force him to move or tell him not to be afraid. She simply stayed with him, her presence a steady reassurance, and for the first time he believed it. As the weeks turned into months, Hunter realized something. This wasn't just a temporary home. This was his home. He belonged here. He belonged to her, and she belonged to him. Hunter's story is proof that every dog deserves a second chance. Right now, thousands of shelter dogs are waiting, just like he was, hoping for someone to see past their scars and give them love. If this story touched your heart, consider adopting, fostering, donating, or simply spreading awareness. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to change a life forever.